Jose Salvador Alvarenga was found on Ebon Atoll January 30th, 2014. He had been drifting across the Pacific Ocean for 438 days in a 23-foot topless fiberglass skiff. He and Ezekiel Cordoba left their Mexican village on November 17th, 2012. They were planning on fishing for 30 hours, which would not have been a challenge for the very experienced Jose, but a 5-day storm swept them from the coast and flooded their engine. 4 months in, Ezekiel got food poisoning and starved to death. For 4 days, suicide called Jose's name, but his Christian faith kept him strong. Jose promised Ezekiel that he wouldn't eat his corpse, but he did talk to the corpse for 6 days before dumping it overboard because he was afraid that he was losing his mind. After swimming to shore and being found by someone on the island, Jonathan Franklin wrote a book about the journey. After the book was published, Ezekiel's family tried to sue Jose for eating their son. And that's a bunch of bullshit, but I've never lost a loved one, so I can't say for certain how I would react. What's irrefutably bullshit is that Jose's lawyer made him take a lie detector test 2 months after being found. What would he have been lying about? How did he not get scurvy or die from dehydration? Turtle blood.
Occasionally, the turtles are very tame. I was lying down and thinking about things, and then a turtle would hit my boat and attach itself to it and start chewing at my boat. And since turtles are tame, I would pick them up and put them in my boat, and this is how I quenched my thirst, from their blood. But it did me good as it was a source of water, and I normally ate the turtle's meat.
He also collected rainwater in upturned plastic containers that he found while passing through the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. He reports to have seen many container ships but was unable to get their attention. Fraser Christian, a sea survival teacher, called Jose's story remarkable but not unique. Here's a list of other people who also got lost at sea. Jose Salvador Alvarenga was an experienced fisherman, but not necessarily a transoceanic sailor before his non-consensual journey, so I'll put him in A tier. Silence and solitude are dastardly opponents. I don't believe in the Abrahamic God, but his faith was the only thing keeping him from suicide. A noteworthy occurrence of religion actually doing the thing it's supposed to do, giving people hope. On February 4th, 2019, Travis Kaufman wrestled a mountain lion, killing it with his bare hands.
And I turned around and was pretty bummed out to see a mountain lion chasing after me. I stopped and I threw my hands up in the air and I started shouting. Unfortunately, the shouts didn't deter it. It kept running and lunged at me. It was going toward my face, so I threw up my hands to kind of block my face, at which point it grabbed onto my hand and wrist. From there, it started to claw at my face and neck, and that's when kind of my fear response turned into more of a fight response. I tried to throw it off, and then we took a little tumble down the south side of the trail. I was grabbing around for sticks. I only had my left hand free. My right hand was still locked in its jaws. Tried to get at its neck to see if I could stab it in the neck to get it to release. That wasn't working. The sticks were breaking. So then I picked up a rock that I had seen kind of near us. Tried to give it a few bashes in the back of the head. I knew with 2 pretty good blows to the back of the head that it didn't release, that I was probably gonna have to do something a little more drastic. I stepped on its neck with my right foot. Slowly, after a few minutes, I thought I'd be getting close, and then it'd start thrashing again, and had a few more scratches. Another couple minutes later, it finally stopped moving, and then jaws opened, and I was able to kind of scramble back up the hill.
I've never wrestled a wild animal, but it is on my bucket list. I did go hand to hand, or rather hand to tooth, with at least a dozen street dogs in Puno, but we never locked up like Travis did. If you want to watch me beat the hell out of my mom's dog for 20 minutes, that's in this video. Everyone on this list is so much more badass than me. I don't even belong in D tier. This whole tier system, though, it's nonsense. Travis Kaufman, A tier. Boom. Similarly, here's an article about a guy wrestling free from a freshwater crocodile, but I couldn't find anything about it but this article, so moving on. On March 6th, 2000, Enz Ramirez Perez gave herself a C-section by herself with zero medical training in the Mexican mountains.
I couldn't stand the pain anymore. If my baby was going to die, then I decided I would have to die too. But if he was going to grow up, I was going to see him grow up, and I was going to be with my child. I thought that God would save both of our lives.
The nearest midwife was 80 kilometers away. Inez had no neighbors, and the father was out drinking with some friends. After 12 hours of labor pains, she realized that her baby was not going to be born. Some sources said she drank 3 glasses of liquor. Another source said she drank a full bottle of medicine. All sources agree that she then used a kitchen knife to cut open her abdomen in 3 attempts over an hour.
Blood came out of me like a fountain.
She stuck her hand inside the 17-centimeter opening and moved her organs out of the way.
Then I cut open my womb and pulled Orlando out by his feet. He cried straight away.
At the time, Inez was 39.
I had 7 children before Orlando. There were no problems with the births, but the 8th baby died. My water broke and the midwife said I needed a cesarean, but I couldn't get to the hospital in time. I felt the baby struggling, but then it stopped moving.
After wrapping her abdomen in cloths, she sent her eldest son to go find help. Sometime later, 2 men from the village arrived, finding her conscious and alert. One of the 2 had some first aid training, so he stitched her up with a sewing needle and thread. Inez and Orlando arrived at a hospital 12 hours later, having ridden in the back of a pickup truck. In my research, I couldn't find a recent interview, but these photos show Orlando with several years of age. Unlike Enz Ramirez Perez, Leonid Rogozov and Jerry Nielsen both had medical training. Leonid was the doctor accompanying a Soviet expedition to the South Pole, who gave himself an appendectomy in April 1961. Jerry was the resident doctor at a neighboring station in 1998 when she had to extract her own breast cancer. Rogozov died 39 years after his self-surgery and Nielsen 11. All 3 survived, but only the Mexican was winging it. She had 0 training. She looked death in the eye and refused to shake its hand, improvisationally. And now I must shake her hand. But that's a video for mid-June. For this, Enz Ramirez Perez gets an absolute S-tier ranking, with Leonid Rogozov and Jerry Nielsen both being put in C-tier. In April 2003, Aaron Ralston got his arm trapped under a rock while mountaineering in Utah. After 5 days, he cut off his own arm with a dull knife. In 2010, a movie was made about the ordeal with James Franco, which Aaron said,
So factually accurate, it is as close to a documentary as you can get and still be a drama.
Cutting your own arm off is not as complex as a C-section, but breaking your own bone and then cutting through the flesh does sound horrendous. He did have a bit of water, but 5 is a large number in terms of days with only half of a liter. And then his own pee. Oh my god. I'll put him in A tier. Tsutomu Yamaguchi survived the bombings of both Nagasaki and Hiroshima. I can't put him in a tier because his survival was basically just extreme luck, but I bring him up because he has a great quote. The only people who should be allowed to govern countries with nuclear weapons are mothers, those who are still breastfeeding their babies. Yulian Kopecki survived 11 days in the Amazon after her plane crashed when she was 17. But apparently people survive plane crashes so frequently that there's an entire Wikipedia article about it. She and her mother were buying flights from Lima to Pucallpa for Christmas Eve. Yulian's father urged his wife to buy different tickets because the airline had a poor reputation. He was right, because the plane was struck by lightning and fell apart. Yulian fell 3 kilometers strapped to her seat. She had some pretty gnarly injuries from the crash, but her training served her well. Her parents established the Panguana Research Station in the Peruvian Amazon, where she learned what would later save her life. After the crash, When she finally found the fisherman who would transport her to safety, she had a botfly infestation in her arm, which is when a fly plants its larvae in the skin of a person. The larvae eats the flesh of its victim before emerging. But that's another video for another day, probably a short.
I had nightmares for a long time, for years. And of course, the grief about my mother's death and that of the other people came back again and again. The thought, why was I the only survivor, haunts me. It always will.
She did have prior training, but she was only 17 and pretty injured. A tier. In 2006, Robert Hewitt survived 75 hours floating alone in the ocean after being separated from his dive boat in Fiji. He was a very experienced diver in the Navy, so he knew to stay in the fetal position to conserve body heat by reducing surface area. He also knew that you shouldn't drink a ton of water the first day you're lost.
The delay in drinking stimulates hormone-mediated body water conservation pathways, and thereafter a greater quantity of fluid intake is retained. Unlike fluid consumption, starvation is far less of an imminent threat. Limiting food consumption, especially protein, whilst not on a long-term survival plan, can assist with water conservation.
When they found him, they had to hose him off with fresh water to remove all the sea lice. He was hallucinating quite a bit, but stabilized pretty quickly with an IV rehydrating him. I would have died within a sixth of that time, but I'm not the one who's dived 1,000 times, and he had a 5mm wetsuit, so B tier? Sure. Our second plane crash survivor, Greg Rasmussen, is a conservationist, researcher, and biologist focused primarily on the African painted dog. Not to be confused with the African spotted hyena, whose females have penises, which I talked about in this video. Fans of Salmonella already know his story. He heard about a rare rhino in the area, so he piloted a plane to go check it out. But his pilot couldn't take him, so he had to crash his own plane, like a man.
Blood trickled from my nose, and, far more worrying, my legs were totally lifeless. With some relief, I realized I could at least wiggle my toes. The impact had detuned the radio, and the keypad was frozen. I had no idea if anybody would hear my mayday call. I heard leaking petrol, and I knew I had to get out. Using only my arms, I pulled out of the cockpit and dragged myself away. I was lucky to be alive, but I knew that I'd broken both femurs. I had to untie my boots to relieve an explosive pain in my feet. But how? It took me 2 hours to unpick my laces with a thin stick and push them off the hill with a bigger one. It was midday and very hot. My lips were cracked and a dryness in my mouth indescribable. I was seriously dehydrated. My only option was to seek shade under the inflammable remains of my plane. As I moved, I felt my muscles contracting around the jagged, broken femurs and a sickening creak in my pelvis that, too, was broken. The sun set around 6. Elephants lower down the hillside trumpeted and stampeded. The soft call of a lioness. I had never before felt so vulnerable in the bush. I beat hard on the windscreen and all went quiet. It was going to be a long night.
His partners did know where he was going, so he was found after only about 36 hours, which is still a long time, but I'm saying that only because Aaron Ralston was trapped for 127 hours because he didn't tell anybody where he was going. But Greg Rasmussen was dehydrated before getting on the plane, and Wanje is 32 degrees right now, but that's not as nightmarish as 2 broken legs with elephants and lions lurking about. So A tier. Oh, and after all of his post-rescue surgeries on his legs, he's now 3 inches shorter. So there you go. The 9 plus 3 craziest survival stories I could find, ranked in an arbitrary and utterly meaningless fashion. Next video, Suicide and Sonder. I'll talk about the philosophy of comparison, but this video is already long enough. All in all, just be conscientious of your water consumption.
It was grinding at, like, after I hit him in the head with the rock, it started grinding his teeth back and forth, and I could hear kind of ligaments and tendons shifting around in there, and that it hurt, but I also remember the sound of that was pretty disturbing.